Today, we're going to dive into a very nautical paint color by Sherwin-Williams. Let's take a look at Seaworthy and some of its color pairings so you can decide if it's the right color for your project. The color code is SW7620. We got the code, now let's get to cracking. Even though 2022 is shaping up to be a pretty green year for paint color, there's still a persistent admiration for darker navy blues. And one of our subscribers reminded me of a Sherwin-Williams color called Seaworthy, so I thought I would talk about it today. Being the show color code, I'm going to give you a light, medium, and dark color pairing for Seaworthy, as well as a corresponding trim color that could work, so that way you have a solid amount of inspiration to get you going on your colorful, seaworthy journey. I think it's also important to touch on some of the other navy blues by Sherwin-Williams and compare them so you can understand how Seaworthy differs from all those other colors. If that sounds delightful, then hit that like button and let's start talking about this color. Right off the bat, with a name like Seaworthy, we know we're getting a blue here. It's an extremely saturated navy with a light reflectance value of 7. This means that it reflects only 7% of the light that hits it when it's used on a surface like your walls or your cabinets or even your furniture. This equates to a pretty deep and dark color. What's cool about Sherwin-Williams and most other prominent paint companies is they give you a decent amount of technical information right on their website regarding the paint color. And this is how you can find the LRV of nearly any color, just by clicking on the Details tab and checking out the LRV. But Sherwin-Williams also gives you the RGB value as well as the hex value. And I know some of you are asking about those pieces of information. They're helpful to know, but not necessarily something that I rely on as a color consultant. RGB values stand for red, green, blue, and depict color in the digital space. So things like television screens or monitors. The hex value is a code that reflects the color if you were to use it on maybe your website. So if you wanted a seaworthy color background on your personal homepage, you would just put in this hex value and you would get that color. But it doesn't necessarily reflect how it looks in person, which is what I think you're all here for. As far as navy blues go, Seaworthy will still retain a lot of its visual blueness, and it won't come across as an off black color like some of the other darker variations that you might see, which we'll touch on later on in this video. Let's start talking about the colors that I've chosen to pair alongside Seaworthy. Color pairing number 1 is going to be our lighter color. So even though Seaworthy is a pretty deep and rich color, navy blues in general are pretty timeless in the world of design. They've existed for a while, and I still think they'll be used prominently moving forward. You'll often see navy blue paired with off-whites because they really play off one another very, very well. The light color that I enjoy here is called Wind Fresh White, color code SW7628. And it's because it does feel more like a light muted beige that is combined with a tad of brown and some gray. Comparatively speaking, Wind Fresh White will feel, coincidentally, pretty fresh and white next to Seaworthy, even though it has an LRV of 69, making it light, but not quite feeling like a true bright white. This gives it a lot of flexibility as a color, in the sense that you can use it on your walls while still having clean, contrasting white trim that will pop against it. But on its own, it's never going to feel dark and muggy like some darker colors would. So if we go back to that Details tab on the Sherwin-Williams website for Wind Fresh White, you can actually see the RGB value here does a decent job at telling you about the color, and that doesn't always happen. The information here is surprisingly relevant. You can see that it's a bit higher on the red side of things, and this explains that slight brown or taupe we're seeing present, compared to a full-on grayish, which is more yellow or green leaning. You can also see that it was curated into a few color collections by Sherwin-Williams, one of which is the Cool White collection. And I can tell you that when combined with Seaworthy, Wind Fresh White will not really feel very cool at all, especially when you have all that surrounding blue coming in. It's going to sit in a nice sweet spot of cozy but still contemporary, which is why I've chosen it. I think it's a pretty good choice. Moving on to the second color, which is the Midtone Color. And what we have here is a fairly dark mid-tone color, all things considered. Its LRV is 39, and that's usually at the low end of mid-tone colors. I try and pick colors that are a bit higher in the light reflectance value, but because this one introduces so much warmth, it is acceptably deep as the second color pairing here. In other words, it won't really feel all that dark. The color code is SW6339, and the name is called persimmon, which is a rather unique fruit that I spotted at my in-laws' place when I went to visit them over the holidays. It's truly a peculiar fruit that resembles a tomato more than anything, but I guess a tomato is a fruit too, technically, so maybe that isn't too surprising. Anyway, I don't care if it has seeds. Tomatoes, they're vegetables to me. You know, say what you want. Science. But I will say, in real life, persimmon, the fruit, will look a lot more like a fiery yellow-orange, but the paint color persimmon is much closer to a rose gold or copper coloration. I absolutely love the complementary nature of dark navy blues and those warm, bright modern metallics. So things like gold or brass, those are great. But there has also been an emergence of those dusty rose colors that were being used alongside colors like Seaworthy, all those navy blues. So to me, persimmon sort of combines both of those looks into one color. It's a tiny bit pinky or rosy with its abundance of red, but it still has that slightly terracotta fiery warmth as well. This is my choice for the accent color here, because although it's not completely complementary or opposing on the color wheel, it's pretty darn close. In fact, you could almost say it's split complementary or even triadic, especially if you add a pop of yellow to complete the look. If none of those terms make sense to you, I'll definitely leave our complementary color explainer video in the cards up top so you can stay in the know. Now, what about the dark color pairing in this situation? Because Seaworthy is so rich in color itself, I wanted a dark color that was similar in depth, but more of a neutral baseline color. The one that I found conveniently has completely equal RGB numbers, 88 across the board, which again is not something that I normally consider, but it's just noteworthy in this case. The color code is SW7674, and the color is called Peppercorn. This is a sleek slate gray with an LRV of 10, so technically it's a tad lighter than Seaworthy, but you wouldn't really notice that in person. They both are deep, dark colors, but what I like about Peppercorn is it doesn't really look black. And this comes from an abundance of gray colorant rather than just pure on black colorant. Even though it's extremely neutral, if we're talking about the color independently, it can sometimes show a tiny bit of coolness and practicality, even a hint of green. But this will melt away when it's nearby Seaworthy. There are some cases where some of the bluish green in navy blue can literally reflect onto Peppercorn, which could create some color cast, but normally a Peppercorn wall will simply accentuate the color hue in Seaworthy, making it even more blue. My thought process here was to simply have a secondary dark color to support Seaworthy, which will also allow a third accent color to really pop. Let that persimmon pop, y'all. Now we're coming to the trim color choice here. And your trim can include all of your woodwork, so your baseboards, your window frames, your door frames, even your doors and your crown molding. I've always been a fan of continuing dark colors like Seaworthy onto your trim and your baseboards when you're using it on your walls, but I also understand that there's a lot of you that will want your baseboard color especially to continue throughout your space or even your whole home, so you don't need to keep track of multiple baseboard colors for future reference. And this means you're more likely to go with something close to white. The color we spoke about earlier, Windfresh White, is a decent choice in its own right as a trim color, but it's still going to be darker than what I would recommend for most people. And even though it's going to feel light next to Seaworthy, it still has that 69 LRV, which may look too dark for white trim. And that's why I opted for something lighter, but not too bright, because we're working with already dark colors in general. So for the trim color, the color code is SW7007, and funnily enough, it's called Ceiling Bright White, but you might as well call it trim bright white because it's not a color that's limited to the ceiling. It will do a serviceable job on trim and woodwork, and that's where I would use it in this case. Its LRV is surprisingly low for a white at 83, but I think its depth allows it to soften with a bit of gray and a general crispness that's not found in many whites. It really pairs nicely with Seaworthy because I find that for a navy blue, it can sometimes have a touch of teal present. But ceiling bright white as a trim color will help it stand alone as a navy blue more prominently. I also like it because it's different enough from Windfresh white, where if you were to use one on your walls and the other on trim, they'll still look different enough. And that's usually a nice thing to have with your design. A bit of contrast from your walls and your baseboards. So before we finish up, I think it's important to compare Seaworthy to two other noteworthy navy blues by Sherwin-Williams, just so you know what you're getting yourself into. First, let's look at Salty Dog as a comparison, because I had to include it for that marvelous name. It's based on a drink, but it's also a term that is a bit of a sailor slang, so I thought thematically it works too. Compared to Seaworthy, Salty Dog feels a little more blue in comparison, and it's also a bit deeper and less dusty. This is also reflected in its LRV, which is a bit lower at 5 compared to 7. So when you have the two side by side, Seaworthy almost looks teal in comparison. That's not to say that it will feel green in your space necessarily, but you can start to see that touch of green in Seaworthy when you compare it to something that's a little more heavy-handed with blue. Finally, let's compare it to Naval, just because I want to keep this nautical theme going. Naval is an important color to talk about here because not only was it featured in tons of Sherwin-Williams color collections over the past couple of years, but it was even their 2020 color of the year. You can really see a significant difference between these two colors, even though they're both definitely navy blue. Naval is a shaded navy that almost has a really dark denim coloration. Its LRV is 4, so that makes it dark enough where you could mistake it for black or charcoal gray in certain cases. And next to Seaworthy, it almost feels like there's the slightest bit of purple undertone in it. The perceived undertones are largely going to be impacted by your lighting. In some cases, Seaworthy may look a bit teal. In other cases, Naval may look a bit purple. But really, in most cases, they're both navy blue, they just do things a little bit differently. There's another navy blue by Benjamin Moore that I think you'd be interested in right here. We did a color code episode all about it, and it's called Gentleman's Gray, which is definitely way more blue than gray.